Could Georgia Tech make the playoffs in 2025? Yes, I'm talking about the college football playoffs. It's not as crazy as it might sound, I don't think. I mean, look at the schedule over there. Lambda, lambda, lambda. I know stuff. Oh, yeah, good morning, and that is Uncle Lou here. That's right, it is me, Uncle Lou, live on LouTube for you. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it also, and in addition to that as well, make sure you subscribe to the channel if you're not already. We're less than 3 weeks away from the start of the season. I couldn't be more excited. We're going to have a great time this year here on the channel, just like we do every year. Been doing this for 11 years. We have built a great community of college football fans from coast to coast here, teams or fans of teams from all across the country. Make sure you subscribe, hit the thumbs up. Like I mentioned, the college football season literally right around the corner. We do call-in shows every Tuesday and Thursday night, live streams every week, and we have a really good time. Come join the party. All right, we're going to talk about Georgia Tech today. I'm going to give you a prediction, a game-by-game prediction for Georgia Tech. We're going to go through the schedule here in a few minutes. I'll give you a winner for every single week, but I'm not trolling at the beginning here. I don't think it's crazy to think that Georgia Tech could potentially make a run for the playoffs in 2025. When you look at this schedule here, and we're going to go through it like I mentioned, this is a very manageable schedule here for Georgia Tech in 2025. Most people, when they talk about the ACC heading into this season, you talk about Clemson. Now, they do play Clemson, a lot more on that game here in a second, but they don't play Miami. I don't see Louisville on here. I don't see SMU on here. Those are sort of the teams that people talk about having a shot to win the ACC. So when you avoid the majority of what people would consider to be the top 5 or 6 teams in a conference, it's a pretty manageable schedule, and they get Clemson at home, kind of. They're moving all their games to Mercedes-Benz Stadium, but the game is in Atlanta. Anyway, they've got a couple of interesting non-con games to start the season and end the season. We're going to get to the schedule in a second, and I'll get more into it, but I don't think it's crazy to think that Georgia Tech might end up making a push for the playoffs this season. All right, what happened last year with Georgia Tech? Not a great year, but by their standards recently, a pretty good year. I mean, they finished the year 7-6. They were 7-5 in the regular season, and then lost a bowl game to Vandy. Now, some of their losses, you say, well, you know, that sort of makes sense. They lost on the road at Louisville. Louisville was a pretty good team last year, right? They lost on the road at Syracuse. Syracuse was a 9-win team in the ACC. You know, they were 9-3 last year. So, you know, first half of the season, 2 road losses to 2 pretty good teams, 2 ranked teams. Not that you want to be losing those games, but those aren't what anybody would consider to be an embarrassing loss for Georgia Tech, I don't think. You then lost at home to Notre Dame. Okay, well, Notre Dame played for the national title last year. So again, not that you should put yourself in a situation where you're accepting losses, but so far you've lost to 3 pretty good teams, right? And then there's the loss at Virginia Tech, and this is the one that just can't be explained. That's the loss that Georgia Tech has to stop taking every year. Not specifically the Virginia Tech loss, but just the loss where you go, you know, what are they doing? You know, they beat Miami, but then can't beat Virginia Tech, and this is a theme sort of for Georgia Tech for a while. Now, they're way better now than they were under Jeff Collins, obviously. Brent Key has got them I think moving in the right direction, significantly better than they were 3 or 4 years ago. But you have to stop losing these games to terrible teams like Virginia Tech, because this turns an 8-4 season into a 7-5 season. This loss to Georgia Tech, and you nearly beat Georgia on the road to end the season. And honestly, probably should have. I think Georgia Tech outplayed Georgia well, they definitely outplayed them in the first half. The second half, Georgia mounted the comeback. The game ends up going to overtime. And had it not been for what I think is probably the worst overtime play calling in the history of college football by Georgia Tech's offensive coordinator, Buster Faulkner, I think Georgia Tech wins that game. I don't know why Georgia Tech didn't run Haynes King in overtime of that game. You know, the overtime rules now, once you get to the second or third overtime, whatever it is, you're just running 2-point conversions over and over and over again. So you've got the ball at the 2.5-yard line. Has anybody watched Georgia defensively the last couple of years? They can't stop a running quarterback. you're going to get 4 or 5 yards every single time you run your quarterback against Georgia. Period. The Notre Dame game, Riley Leonard did it. Georgia Tech did it for the entire game until overtime. Then overtime comes around, and I'm like, why aren't they running Haynes King here? It's a bunch of dumb pass plays or whatever it was they were doing. I'm like, now, as a Georgia guy, I was happy that they didn't run Haynes King at overtime for it. But anyway, terrible. And they end up dropping that game to Georgia in 8 overtimes, 44-42. They end the regular season 7-5, and then the loss to Vandy in the bowl game. Now, look, we all know how the bowl game things work now. You know, this wasn't some high-level bowl game. It was the Birmingham Bowl. So Vandy wins the game. So Vandy and Vandy fans, you know, yeah, we won the bowl game. We beat Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech lost the bowl game, so Georgia Tech and the fans go, it's a meaningless bowl game. Doesn't matter. Players don't care. But whatever. However you feel about the bowl game is how you feel about the bowl game. Never good to be losing to Vandy, in my opinion, though, even for Georgia Tech. So 7-5 in the regular season, 7-6 after a disappointing loss to Vandy in the Birmingham Bowl. What's Georgia Tech going to look like in 2025? Well, they get a lot of pieces back from what was a pretty good offense last year in the ACC. I've got some questions about their offensive line. They got some pieces to replace defensively, but I think they're going to be at least as good as they were last year, at a minimum. And I think they could potentially be much better. The sort of expectation when you talk to Georgia Tech people, or really just college football people, is that Georgia Tech, like I mentioned at the top of the video, could push for ACC title contention. And we all know in today's age of the 12-team playoff, winning the ACC means getting into the playoffs. And I think we'll talk about more about that in a second. But they get a bunch of key pieces returning on both sides of the ball. Most of their coaching staff returns. Offensively, they'll have Haynes King back at quarterback, who, like I mentioned, had a pretty good year. Last year. They also get his backup back, so they get QB1 and QB2 are back, which is a big deal in today's college football because a lot of times now you lose your number 2 to the portal in the offseason. Georgia Tech keeps both their QB1 and QB2. Jamal Haynes is back, who was their leading rusher last year. Wide receiver Malik Rutherford is back. They were 6th in the ACC last year in total offense. Georgia Tech was 424.5 yards per game. A really good running team, too. 2nd in the conference in rushing yards at 187 yards per game. The offensive coordinator, Buster Faulkner, talked about him earlier. I think he's a good offensive coordinator. Great offensive mind. He blew it in that overtime, though. But I do think he's a good offensive coordinator. Quarterback coach Chris Winkie. There's a throwback name back from Florida State back in the day. Anyway, so you get a lot of pieces back, especially at the skill positions. You get quarterback, running back, Malik Rutherford's back. Offensive line is my one concern for Georgia Tech offensively, outside of depth. In depth, again, in today's college football, depth is kind of a concern for almost every single team. But they lose 3 of their offensive linemen from last year. They lose both tackles and their center. The 2 guards are back, but they're going to have to find some answers on the outside and at center along the offensive line. Defensively, again, they get the coordinator back. Or no, they lost their coordinator defensively. Offense, Buster Faulkner is back. They did lose their defensive coordinator to the NFL, so they actually brought in the defensive backs coach, I believe it was, from Texas. Who did he play at Georgia Tech? No, he played at Texas. Became defensive backs coach at Texas. Now hired by Georgia Tech to run their defense over there. They've got a pretty solid rotation at linebacker, Kyle Efford, E.J. Lightsey, who's a good player, versatile secondary, highlighted by safety Clayton Powell-Lee. They run the 4-2-5, and I guess they're going to keep that scheme even with the new defensive coordinator. The defensive front, the defensive line, they get Vanderberg back. They add a transfer from Ole Miss. So again, it's kind of a mixed match approach here. Let's bring some pieces back. Let's go to the portal, sort of fill in the holes and the gaps. This is the approach you see most teams taking with the transfer portal. Rather than flipping over an entire roster, you're sort of filling holes. I think Georgia Tech's doing the transfer portal the right way. I think Georgia Tech could be a good team. What does Vegas think about Georgia Tech's chances in 2025? Not that it necessarily matters. You know, you can be picked to finish last and make the playoffs. Arizona State's an example of this from last year. Vegas had them dead last in the Big 12. They ended up winning the Big 12, made the playoffs. But it does give you an idea sort of a general idea about what people feel about a team heading into a season to look at some of these Vegas numbers. So I like to look at the win totals. What is the expected win total for Georgia Tech in 2025? I couldn't believe this. It's 7.5. Before we even get to the prediction, which is coming up in a minute here, I can tell you right now, there's no way this goes under. This is as close to a sure bet as I've seen. Georgia Tech is winning more than 7.5 games. I know you can't win 7.5 games. This is a betting number, so you're betting over or under. I don't see any way possible Georgia Tech loses 5 of these games. Do you? Is there anyone watching thinks Georgia Tech loses 5 of these games? I don't see it. I love the over 7.5, but Vegas has their win total at 7.5. What about their chances to win the ACC, which of course would be a guaranteed ticket to the college football playoff? Well, they're 5th in the odds in the ACC, and they're sort of the next team in line behind the 4 teams that competed for the SEC title last year. I know only 2 teams. There were 4 teams that were, pretty good. Clemson, Miami, Louisville, and SMU were the 4 teams last year heading into November that you said, okay, we're going to get an ACC title game out of 2 of those 4 teams. Clemson's got the best odds to win the ACC right now at plus 105. Miami behind them at plus 390. Louisville plus 750. SMU plus 900. And then you've got Georgia Tech in 5th at plus 1400. For the money, I think Georgia Tech is a good bet to win the ACC. Not that I think they'll win it or should be the favorite to win it, but the payout versus the chances they actually have of winning, I think are pretty good there. Duke is behind them at plus 2,800 in case you're wondering. All right, let's go through the schedule. Let's figure it out. I can't believe I'm even talking about this, but can Georgia Tech find a way to make the playoffs in 2025? They're probably going to have to beat Georgia to do it. I think they're probably going to have to beat Georgia to do it. I think they're probably going to end up with a couple of conference losses. And the way I have the ACC shaking out this year, I've got Clemson and Miami, I believe, with only 1 conference loss each. I've got them both with 2 losses total, but only 1 conference loss. I think Georgia Tech is probably losing 2 conference games. That would mean they need to beat Georgia at the end of the year to avoid a 3rd loss, or Colorado at the beginning or whatever. So I guess to sort of answer the question at the beginning instead of the end, I'm not sure Georgia Tech can make the playoffs in 2025, although I think they are going to have a shot. I think they are going to have a chance. Let's go through the schedule here. I think the 2 most important games of the year, well, the 3 most important games of the year, in my opinion, for Georgia Tech this year are the first game of the year at Colorado, the last game of the year against Georgia, and week 3 at home against Clemson. These are massive games for Georgia Tech. The Clemson game is probably the biggest just because winning your conference now guarantees you a spot in the playoffs. And if Georgia Tech, just look at this schedule here. If Georgia Tech beats Clemson, in other words, if we find out in week 3 that Georgia Tech is good enough to beat Clemson, where's the conference loss? There's not one. If they beat Clemson, they're not losing a conference game. Or if they do, it would be a massive upset. If they do beat Clemson, they're not losing 2 conference games. I guess what I'm telling you is if they beat Clemson in week 3, they're going to the ACC title game, in my opinion. Probably against Miami if that were to happen, if they were to beat Clemson. I feel like that's a massive game. Now, the second way to get into the playoffs, other than winning the ACC, would be what? Not winning the ACC, but only having 2 losses or less. That's where the Colorado and the Georgia game come into play. I think Georgia Tech's better than Colorado, and I expect Georgia Tech to win that game. And they need to win that game. If they don't, it's going to be hard for them to get into the playoffs without winning the ACC. Same thing with the Georgia game at the end. If they take a couple of conference losses and then they get to that Georgia game and lose, that would be a 3rd loss. And they're likely not making the ACC championship game with 2 conference losses. So that a loss to Georgia could potentially eliminate them from any at-large contention for the playoffs. So those, I think, are the 3 biggest games. Let's go through the schedule. I'll tell you what I think is going to happen. I think they beat Colorado in week 1. Way too much turnover out there for Colorado, which has kind of become the norm there. I talked about how I like Georgia Tech's approach to the portal, more of a filling holes approach. Colorado turns the thing over every single year. They almost ignore high school recruiting at this point, and I just don't think it's going to work. Plus, obviously, they lost 3 or 4 of their best players to the draft, and they don't recruit at a level to be able to replace those guys. You're talking about Shedeur Sanders, Travis Hunter, Shiloh Sanders, a couple of the wide receivers. They're going to have one of the worst running games in all of America. I think Georgia Tech will have their way with Colorado on the road in Boulder. They're 1-0. Come back home, you beat Gardner-Webb, obviously, name your score type of situation there. And then there's this massive game against Clemson. Now, I've done the Clemson version of this video already, so if you've seen that, you know. I am picking Clemson to win the game. I think Clemson has national title potential in 2025. Now, that being said, I give Georgia Tech a shot here. It's at home. It's early in the year. You would expect Georgia Tech to be healthy here. If they can jump on Clemson in this game early, somehow get their crowd into the game, which is not always easy to do at Bobby Dodd. And look, I'm not here to talk crap about Georgia Tech in this video, okay? The reality is it's not a great home field advantage. It's not. But if Georgia Tech can get up early on Clemson in that thing and get the crowd into the game and make life hard for Cade Klubnik, maybe force a couple of turnovers and find a way to get that win, it would be massive. I just can't predict that to happen right now. I do have Georgia Tech losing that game at home to Clemson. But then I think they go on a roll. I mean, they're going to destroy Temple. They're going to win on the road at Wake Forest. They have a bye week. Everybody gets 2 bye weeks. Again, you come out of your first bye week, and this is a revenge game from last year for no reason. Again, this is the game last year you shouldn't have lost. Maybe at Wake Forest is that game this year. Don't lose that game at Wake Forest. You're too good of a program right now under Brent Key to be losing to the lower half of the ACC. Again, if you find yourself in a situation where you're getting beat by the Clemsons, the Miamis, the Louisvilles, the SMUs, okay, whatever. Again, not that you should accept that, but that would be losing games to the sort of upper tier ACC teams. You're past the point of losing these types of games. You got to beat Wake Forest. You got to beat Virginia Tech. The Duke game, I think Duke and Georgia Tech are very similar. Duke was actually better than Georgia Tech last year in terms of a record. Duke won about they went 9-3 last year. They under a first-year head coach, Manny Diaz. Now he's back. Now they got a new quarterback, but you got to play them there. I think Duke wins this game. I'm sorry. I told you, I feel like Georgia Tech's going to lose a couple of conference games. I think Duke's one of them. I got you losing at home to Clemson, losing on the road at Duke. Now, this will be a good game, and this is a game that Georgia Tech could win, clearly. You could win this game. I've obviously been wrong before. But on the road, middle of the season, things starting to wear on you a little. I've got Georgia Tech dropping that game on the road at Duke. But then you come back home and get what I think is going to be a pretty good win against Syracuse. Syracuse, another team like Georgia Tech, like Duke, that I would put in sort of that second tier of the ACC right now, right? Again, you've got Clemson, Miami, Louisville, SMU. Those are sort of your clear front runners right now in the ACC. And then you've got a second group that I think includes Georgia Tech along with Syracuse and maybe Duke. So I think you drop the game on the road at Duke, but beat Syracuse at home. Turn right back around, back out on the road to take on Dave Duran's NC State squad. I'm off the Dave Duran train if I was ever even really on it. I'm just sort of tired of NC State getting hyped up every 2 or 3 years for no reason and then going out and winning 4 or 5 games. Now, with that being said, no one is talking about NC State this offseason, and that tends to be the year where they go on to win 8 games or something, so maybe that happens again. But I think Georgia Tech gets the win on the road at NC State. Then you have a bye week, which I do think is important because back-to-back road games can be difficult no matter who the opponents are, especially a team like Georgia Tech, a program like Georgia Tech. They're good. They're not elite. They're not great. And so you see teams like that slip up a lot when they have to play back-to-back road games. Look at Miami last year, right? What cost Miami their season last year? Road games at the end of the season. Couldn't win them against teams, against inferior teams. Anyway, so a good place for the bye week here. I think you beat both NC State and Boston College. Come back home, play Pitt. I don't think they're going to be very good at all. I think you'll beat Pitt. And then comes the Georgia game. And keep in mind, it's a non-con game. So I've got you with 2 conference losses. So I guess it's possible you find your way into the ACC championship game with the 2 conference losses. Now, the way my predictions are shaping up this season, that won't be the case. It'll be Clemson and Miami, most likely, in the ACC championship game, but it's possible. But if you don't make the ACC championship game, the other way sort of into the playoffs will be as an at-large. And if last year is any indication, you're going to have a 2 losses at the most. And that wouldn't even guarantee it. Miami was 10-2 last year and didn't get in. So the Georgia game becomes huge if you want to have any shot at all, because clearly a 3-loss Georgia Tech team is not getting into the playoffs. I think we all understand that. A 2-loss Georgia Tech team may have a claim. Would they get in? I don't know. But you'd have to beat Georgia at the end of the year. And I don't think you're doing that. It feels like Georgia Tech blew their chance last year. Georgia has had Georgia Tech's number this century. I think Georgia Tech has only beat Georgia 3 times since the turn of the century. It was close. You can make the case that Georgia Tech outplayed Georgia last year, and I would agree with you. They did. I think Georgia Tech deserved to win that game last year. I think bad play calling in overtime cost Georgia Tech that win. And I think a couple of years from now down the road, that loss is going to start to hurt more for Georgia Tech fans than it even hurts now, because you're going to look at it as that was our chance. I think Georgia wins this year. I don't think it will be nearly as close as it was last season. I'm not crapping on Georgia Tech here. I feel like I've been very fair and very complimentary to Georgia Tech, and am admitting I think they have an outside shot to make the playoffs. Like I said, I've been wrong before. Maybe you beat Georgia, Clemson, and Duke. Maybe you go 100-0 like Florida does every offseason. I don't know. But I've got you losing here at home against Clemson, on the road at Duke, and at home against Georgia. Clemson and Georgia are 2 top 10 teams. Whatever you think of Clemson and Georgia, some people would say they were top 5, whatever. Even if you don't think they're top 5, they're 2 top 10 teams. So again, these would not be embarrassing losses. Not that you should accept any losses at all, but those would be what would be, people would consider those good losses. The Duke loss, that might be the one you try to avoid there, although I think Duke's going to be a pretty good team again. But I've got Georgia Tech at 9-3, which will be a massive improvement over last year. Remember, last year they were 7-6, basically a 500 team last year. I've got you now at 9-3. If you want to get mad at me in the comments, call me a hater. Oh, this guy, that, Georgia, whatever, just Georgia fan. I mean, if you're a Georgia Tech fan and you're not happy with 9-3, you're fucking delusional. Even more delusional than I thought you were. Been a long time since you went 9-3, bud. So instead of getting mad at me, maybe you should be happy about whatever Christmas Day Bowl 9-3 puts you in. Anyway, I've got Georgia Tech at 9-3. Have a good morning.